All right, Heather, we're live. Come on and unmute yourself.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining Heritage Talks online. If you've joined us before, welcome back to our series. And if this is your first time joining us, we're really delighted that you're here. My name is Heather Darch, and I'm here with my co-partner, Glenn Patterson, and we are project directors for the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network. QAHN is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to preserve and to promote the history, heritage, and culture of Quebec, and in particular of Quebec's English-speaking communities spread right across the province. If you go to our website at QAHN.org, you'll discover a wide range of activities and projects that we're all involved in. Our project, including Heritage Talks Online, are successful because of the support that we receive from people like you. So thank you very much for joining us this evening. You're welcome to become a QAHN member as well, and membership is open to heritage groups and cultural organizations as well as individuals. And you can go to our website to learn how to become a member, and you can discover all the projects that we're involved in and discover the connections that you can make with the heritage organizations across the province. QAHN is the umbrella group that connects us all. Membership enables us to provide quality workshops and programs and projects that you cannot find anywhere else, including our publication called Quebec Heritage News. And this is a really great publication filled with excellently written stories, beautiful pictures, all about Quebec's past. And you can learn about people, events, and places that you will not find in history textbooks. So I really encourage you to become a member, obtain a copy for yourself, and discover the great network that we do have. In addition, QAHN has just published an anthology called Historical Views, Selections from Quebec Heritage News 2000 to 2020. I don't know if you can see that very well, but this 2-volume set has over 120 articles, 150 pictures, all written by people who have contributed to Quebec Heritage News over the past 20 years. And the set is being sold with the included benefit of membership of 10% off. So it's a great time to become a member. In addition, for the first time for new members, you can take advantage of a 30% discount that we're offering. So if you're on Facebook Live tonight, you can send us a message to say that you'd like to become a member with 30% discount. And if you're on Zoom, same thing, you can send us a message to say you'd like to take advantage of that 30% discount. I really recommend it. It's a good time to become a member, but the offer is only good from the time of the broadcast. So from right now to the time we sign off tonight. So don't waste time. I would like to thank our funders who help in part to put programs like this together, including Canadian Heritage, the Secretariat for Relations with English-Speaking Quebecers, the Toppers Foundation, the Zeller Family Foundation, and the Townshippers Foundation. Thank you very much. The Heritage Talk series has a really great lineup still to come, and you can discover the times of broadcast, the speakers, and their topics on the Heritage Talks Facebook page. And you don't need to have a Facebook account to access that. You can just go to that site. It's a public site, and you can find the speakers that are to come. So you can join us by Facebook Live, like many of you are doing tonight, or you can be pre-registered to click on Zoom. So that's a great way to join us as well. And you can find all those posts on Facebook. As Glenn had mentioned already, we're going to ask that our speaker has time to do his presentation without background noise and people in the way. So we're asking you to please keep yourself muted and your cameras off while he's talking. But at the end, we always like to create a nice community. So please feel free to come on, turn your cameras on again. And if you have a question, you can use the raise hand feature at the bottom of the screen, just right of center under the reactions tab. Or you can do old school and wave your hand like this, and we can have comments and questions for our speaker for sure. So that's at the very end that we'll have questions. So our speaker tonight is Keith Henderson. He's a really well-known novelist and publisher, and he's written for the Los Angeles and New York Times as well as CBS 60 Minutes. His talk this evening is called Not as Crazy as You Think, Canada's Fenian Scare and Thomas D'Arcy McGee. Welcome, Keith, to Heritage Talks Online.
Well, thank you so much, Heather. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be invited. So, as you say, my talk is going to be about Thomas D'Arcy McGee and the Fenians. So I'm just going to go right into it. Now, Quebec separatism has been a traumatizing fact of life for Anglo residents, many of whom witnessed the diaspora in the last third of the 20th century, marked as it was by no fewer than 3 referenda on the status of the province within Canada, plus the murder of a cabinet minister. Scotland had a referendum on independence in 2014. In Spain, Catalonian nationalists want one. Here, the PQ and Quebec Solidaire are looking to round 4 as Britons absorb the consequences of Brexit. All the while longing for a proper Canadian's dose of POG, peace, order, and good government, one could be forgiven for thinking borders and breakups have become the order of the day. Poles themselves know redrawing maps is part of the human condition, and we on our continent haven't exactly escaped it. America was the first separatist state. There wouldn't be a 49th parallel without the revolution to break with British imperial rule in 1775. No revolution, no loyalists. Never having addressed the question of slavery, that revolution's fault spawned yet another separatist bout in 1860. Southern states' unilateral Declaration of Independence, and the US Civil War. Secessionists were brutally defeated. Here in the peaceable kingdom, at roughly the same time, under the auspices of the newspaper The New Nation, Louis Riel established the Legislative Assembly of Assiniboia to give form and substance to the rights of the Métis and Indigenous peoples. His government, Canada's first of separatist aspiration, then proceeded in 1870 to execute a loyal Canadian, Thomas Scott. Later that year, the arrival of a Canadian expeditionary force effectively ended what came to be known as the Red River Rebellion and forced Riel into exile. But the province of Manitoba was carved out of British Northwest Territories and made part of Confederation in 1871. Peacefully, the map of Canada has been redrawn many times since. Not so Great Britain. There, the pendulum swing between local and cosmopolitan has spanned millennia. The Gaelic-speaking European peoples, among the continent's oldest, can be justly called Europe's indigenous, having occupied much of its landmass in the immediate decades before the birth of Christ. At the time, the imperial power was Rome, which under Julius Caesar defeated them and began the process of pushing them to the outer reaches of their living space, Cornwall, Brittany, Wales, Ireland, and the Scottish Highlands, where Gaelic languages persist to this day. The quintessential icon of these defeated peoples remains the famous Roman statue of the dying Gaul. After the disastrous Irish potato famine in 1845 cut the island's population roughly in half, Gaelic people could well understand the symbolism. Only their cosmopolitan imperial master had changed. Carrying their sense of grievance and their hatred of the British crown with them, hundreds of thousands emigrated to North America and fueled the movement for Irish separation and independence. Many died on the voyage, fulfilling the statue's grim prophecy again after almost 2,000 years. 2021 marks the sesquicentennial of the third and final Fenian raid on Canada. 35 ragtag men led by Colonel John O'Neill, all hoping to persuade Louis Riel to join them in their uprising against British authority. O'Neill measured success by bargaining chip. The British might trade Ireland for Canada, and Manitoba's Métis, often Catholic and French-speaking, were a good place to start. Only they weren't. Riel wasn't interested. After capturing a Hudson's Bay Company post, O'Neill was arrested by US Army officials, released on charge. He didn't realize he hadn't actually crossed the border. Opera bouffe, perhaps, but not entirely so. A refugee from the failed 1848 Young Ireland uprising, John O'Mahony, established the Fenians in America in 1858. Their aim, to secure the independence of Ireland by violent means. The organization was not to be taken lightly. American cities along the eastern seaboard sheltered hundreds of thousands of Irish immigrants, as much as a third of the population of New York City. Fenians were well funded. They declared themselves the government of Ireland in exile and issued $10 and $20 bonds to Irish Americans on the promise of repayment when Ireland became a country. Their quasi-embassy in New York City was located in the prestigious Union Square district, flew a green and gold flag with an Irish harp, and housed meetings of Fenian senators and cabinet ministers, for they had constituted themselves along the lines parallel to the US government. They were well armed, and in the streets of Philadelphia mounted paramilitary parades featuring over 6,000 soldiers, all well trained, many of whom had fought in the Civil War. Fenians had the ear of major US political figures, including the Secretary of State, William Seward, and after Lincoln's assassination, the president himself, Andrew Johnson. Little known is the fact that only Lincoln's death in 1865 prevented the US Senate from voting on a bill to deploy, with Fenian approval and complicity, 200,000 soldiers, half Union, half Confederate, to invade Canada. Moreover, as Thomas D'Arcy McGee was aware, Fenians bore the advantage of passionate grievance, inured over centuries, from the Norman conquest on. In The Roof Walkers, I tried to capture some of that indurated rage in Bridget Stevens, one of the twin daughters fictionally ascribed to James Stevens, O'Mahony's colleague and co-founder of the IRA. Here she is, correcting young Owen O'Donoghue, who, after becoming the personal secretary of a prominent New York Fenian, had volunteered to serve as a double agent for the Canadian government.
Hey, Keith, I just want to step in and ask you, we were trying some different microphones. It still sounds a little bit muffled. Would you mind going, you might have to leave the screen share. We can start it again. Maybe leave, I'll stop the screen share. I want to try using another mic just for a second, if you don't mind. And let's see if it.
Are you stopping the share?
Yeah, I'll do that here. Okay. Yeah, so just go into the bottom left there and by that up arrow, select that. The other microphone you had access to seemed to be a little better, although it seemed to maybe cut out. So let's see if we can get that to go.
I'm going to built-in microphone. Okay, I've just chosen the built-in microphone. Does that help?
Yeah, keep it there. It's got a bit of background noise, but it went away all of a sudden. Can you just see if it's still on the built-in microphone? I feel like it goes there, then it switches back to the other one automatically.
Okay,
Check
so,
again.
okay, just do it again. It's on built-in microphone,
It's
not
just the
system.
what maybe just try speaking a bit louder.
Okay, not a problem.
Okay, all right, and then so you're ready to start your screen share again?
Yes, I am.
All right, go for it. Sorry about that, Keith.
Okay, not a problem. Okay, so this is Bridget with her very angry and zealous, perhaps fanatical response to what has happened in Irish history. It starts with Owen saying, I'm sorry, with Bridget saying, Deirdre has told me of your affinity for the English poet Edmund Spenser. Wow. I was prematurely pleased and relieved the conversation had taken a literary turn. I must tell you, I find that affection very disturbing. Deirdre does not concern herself with such matters as much as I, but in your role as personal secretary to Mr. Roberts, as well as for your own sake, I feel it necessary to correct you. Whatever for? Because Edmund Spenser's hatred of our people and our nation is profound and diabolical. That is why. Because this purveyor of sweet civility, as he fancies himself, had he been more than the despicable sheriff of Cork, say the Lord Deputy of Ireland, the rank he coveted, would have done certain things the British authorities did eventually do, so he was for all intents and purposes a precursor and defender of violence and tyranny. He would have banned our people's costumes as abetting vagrancy and thievery, destroyed our herds for the same reason, clipped our men's beards for fear they concealed lawlessness, forbade any name beginning with O or Mac, erased whatever title to land we possessed, and willfully and deliberately put us to the sword and starved us into submission whenever we resisted his plans for the Queen's order as he conceived it. I am happy that he was turned out of the castle he usurped, saw his wife and child murdered, and died for want of bread in London, where he sought vainly to provoke the pity of the English crown he swore by. He was a furtherer of murder and famine, Mr. O'Donoghue, as his view of the present state of Ireland attests, and would have rejoiced in what has sent us fleeing across oceans and wondered why it had taken so long. That is why. I hope you'll forgive my lack of temper, for such a man brings the blood to my face, but I am peeved and angry that you could not notice, or worse, could countenance it.
Keith, I was wondering, do you want to put your screen sharing back on?
I do.
All right. The other thing I'd ask is, how far are you from your laptop? Could you bring it a little bit closer?
I could.
I feel like it might be, if you're off axis, that might be why. I suspect your laptop is to your right.
Okay, it is a little bit to the left.
To left.
No.
Okay. So can you just bring it as close to you as possible?
Okay, let's see if this does the trick. All right. Can you hear me now?
It is a bit better. Now let's do one last thing. Go into, I apologize everyone watching on Zoom and Facebook, but these things come up and we fix them. So go into your audio settings again. We're just going to bring the volume up a little bit. Go into your mute, beside your mute button, that up arrow.
Yeah.
The bottom, click audio settings. And that slider, pull that a little bit to the right. Pull it quite a bit to the right even.
Right. Done it.
Okay. All right, pull all the way. Just start there. Let's
All
see
the way it is. Done.
All right, let's try that. Okay, now, yeah, close that, and then let's open your screen share again. So that's the blue or green button at the bottom.
Okay, share, got it.
All right.
And away we go.
Away we go. Great job, Keith. Thank you.
Okay, Great. Okay, I'll continue. There is no zealot like a convert, and a convert D'Arcy McGee surely was. He began his political adventure as an Irish nationalist, participated in the Young Ireland movement of 1848, an uprising against British authority, and had to flee the island disguised as a priest. America was McGee's Damascus. In and out of the United States since childhood, he came to see in the Republic a kind of rowdyism, a fractious populism, an excess democracy, a tendency towards violence, disorder, and anarchy, all pervaded by anti-Catholic bias, urban poverty, and blight. However, after moving to Canada in 1857 to take up the editorship of The New Era, and with the access of the Civil War, McGee moderated his views. He became passionately opposed to separatist movements in general. In this case, what he called the Confederacy's wanton assault on the legitimate central authority. He tried to tamp down anti-American sentiment, always endemic north of the border, and praised American Republican government as, quote, the highest political experiment in modern times. He allied himself firmly with the forces of American Union, quote, as between continental peace and chronic civil war, as between natural right and oligarchical oppression, as between free intercourse and armed frontiers, as between the constitutional majority and the lawless minority, as between Negro emancipation and the revival of the slave trade, as between the North and the South in this deplorable contest, I rest firmly in the belief that all that is most liberal, most intelligent, and most magnanimous in Canada and the Empire are for continental peace, for constitutional arbitrament, for universal if gradual emancipation, for free intercourse, for justice, mercy, civilization, and the North. Note the conservative nature of the phrase universal if gradual emancipation, consistent with Lincoln's own policies during the middle years of the Civil War, but not, of course, at its end, when Lincoln recognized the need and utility of African-American Union Army troops and freed the slaves. When it suited him, McGee was a gradualist, certainly with respect to Ireland's relations with Great Britain, though not to the future of British North America. There, he put himself in the forefront, one of the first, ablest, and most ardent spokesmen for a Canadian nationality, one that subordinated ethno-religious differences to what he hoped would be an emerging Canadian culture and identity. How refreshing McGee's conception when set beside our current almost universal celebration of difference and diversity. There is room enough in this country for one great free people, he wrote, but there is not room enough under the same flag and the same laws for two or three angry, suspicious, obstructive nationalities. A Canadian nationality, not French Canadian, nor British Canadian, nor Irish Canadian, patriotism rejects the prefix, is, in my opinion, what we should look forward to. That is what we ought to labor for. That is what we ought to be prepared to defend to the death. The key is the subordination, but not the elimination of ethno-religious, now ethno-linguistic or ethno-racial differences. How could it be otherwise for a man so dedicated to minority rights? Although there are two official languages Cher Trudeau once wrote, there is no official culture. And since the incorporation of multiculturalism into the Constitution, Canadian liberalism has tried progressively to expunge the notion of a Canadian culture in favor of particular cultures, however narrowly defined. If Canada has no culture it can call its own, officially recognized, but in this, the great hotel of the North, only the varied cultures of others, then from McGee's standpoint, the country has destroyed its own moral foundations as well as its raison d'etre. For him, the whole had to be greater than the sum of its parts. He found himself at the end of his career turning back to his first love, literature. In his address to the Montreal Literary Club entitled The Mental Outfit of the New Dominion, he extolled the virtues of books and reading. McGee wrote, from reconstructed Italy, so ripe in all intelligence, a new mental kingdom must come forth if the new political kingdom is to stand. He spoke overtly of Italy, but in the back of his mind, his own mental kingdom stood Canada. On the long, slow Ferris wheel of border making, Canada came together in the 1860s, while America came apart. Similar divisions could be seen in the United Kingdom, a kingdom indeed, but hardly united. Not surprisingly, given his stance on Canadian nationality, McGee led the drive for confederation and articulated the many reasons in favor, not least of which the peril presented by what he called the democracy armed and insolent south of the border. That, combined with Britain's reluctance to commit to the colony's perpetual defense. The intercolonial railway was also key. A united Canada needed a reliable all-season military transport system, one that would have the additional benefit of providing what, he wrote, the Austro-Hungarian Empire already possessed in Trieste, a permanent shipping outlet to the sea, in this case, Halifax, Nova Scotia. But McGee's real motive was visionary, best expressed in his Shield of Achilles speech before Parliament in 1860. Quote, I look to the future of my adopted country with hope, though not without anxiety. I see in the not remote distance one great nationality, bound like the shield of Achilles by the blue rim of ocean. I see it quartered into many communities, each disposing of its internal affairs, but all bound together by free institutions, free intercourse, and free commerce. I see within the round of that shield the peaks of the western mountains and the crests of the eastern waves, the winding Assiniboine, the fivefold lakes, the St. Lawrence, the Ottawa, the Saguenay, the St. John, and the basin of Minas. By all these flowing waters, in all the valleys they fertilize, in all the cities they visit in their courses, I see a generation of industrious, contented, moral men, free in name and in fact, men capable of maintaining in peace and in war a constitution worthy of such a country. Counterpoised to this vision of Canadian unity were the efforts of Irish separatists, both within the country and without. McGee knew the danger posed by New York City's Fenians, who were regularly threatening British North America. While in the cabinet, he'd proposed to MacDonald a secret spy operation in New York and likely had men of his own inside both the O'Mahony and the Senate wings of the Fenian movement. He was equally aware of Fenian efforts in Montreal to infiltrate the St. Patrick's Society and take it over in favor of what was known in the day as the physical force side of the equation. McGee was never moderate about such views. He hated them viscerally. If there is the least proof that this foreign disease has seized on the least among you, establish at once for your own sakes, for the country's sake, a cordon sanitaire around your people, he wrote. Establish a committee which will purge your ranks of this political leprosy, weed out and cast off those rotten members who, without a single governmental grievance to complain of in Canada, would yet weaken and divide us in these days of anxiety. Even he, so attuned to Fenian activity in America, found himself caught off guard, as was the whole Canadian government, by John O'Neill's invasion at Ridgeway in June of 1866, where 20 or so young Canadians, many University of Toronto students, died at the hands of these Irish-American marauders. McGee was incensed and wanted the death penalty imposed on those captured, whom he considered no different from pirates on the high seas. Some death penalties were sentenced, but none carried out. One can only imagine how he might have reacted to the fate of Canada's FLQ equivalents, who strangled a provincial cabinet minister with his own crucifix. Exiled to the Cuba of their ideological dreams, they soon demanded return to Quebec. Canada acquiesced. Canada acquiesced. One of them took up a teaching post in Montreal, where for years he educated young men and women in the pleasures of radical sectarian politics. Cordon sanitaire indeed. Did events in Eastport, Maine in April of 1866, a clear victory for Canada, contribute to government complacency at Ridgeway 2 months later? Very likely. As pressure for Confederation mounted that year throughout the colonies, efforts were frustrated by the election of an anti-Confederation government in New Brunswick. MacDonald and McGee were not pleased. They had the British Colonial Office on side, but they didn't know how long that would last. Something had to be done, and they turned to their nemesis to do it. McGee knew nothing could aid the forces of Canadian Union more than threats of violence from the South. If they weren't quite in the offing, they could be manufactured. For years, McGee had collaborated with a journalist colleague called Bernard Doran Killian, a man who happened to have worked himself up the ranks of the O'Mahony wing of the Fenian movement in New York City. In the spring of 1866, he occupied a position as treasurer of that well-funded organization. William R. Roberts, leader of the Fenian Senate wing, had long called for Irish-American attacks on Canada to overrun the colonies and use them as a bargaining chip to secure Irish independence. Not to be outdone or seen as a laggard in the struggle, O'Mahony allowed Killian to convince him into attacking the colonies first, a scheme O'Mahony had always hitherto resisted, believing as he did that revolutionary activity should be concentrated on Ireland itself. Arms were purchased, stowed aboard an old Confederate wreck of a vessel, the E.H. Prey, and shipped to Passamaquoddy Bay, supposedly at the ready for an assault on New Brunswick. Killian himself went to Eastport, Maine in order to stage manage activities up and down the bay directly. What transpired was a hoax, perhaps one of the greatest in pre-Confederation Canada. At the top of the bay, near Calais, Maine, and St. Stephen, New Brunswick, QAHN made every effort to persuade colonists on the British side of the river that a Fenian attack was imminent, all the while knowing that without arms, there could be no violent incursion. The US government had stepped in and impounded the cargo of the QAHN. QAHN persisted anyway, emptying the Fenian treasury in the process. So frightened by these pantomimes were the St. Stephen's, New Brunswick residents that according to contemporary reports, they started streaming across the wooden bridge to Calais, Maine to seek refuge. QAHN's theatrics and the ensuing Fenian scare played a large part in the defeat of Albert Smith's anti-Confederation government. He was replaced that year by the pro-Confederation leader, Samuel Leonard Tilley. In the Roof Walkers, I put the short version of the plan into the mouth of Red McDermott, an actual well-known agent who cunningly played both sides of the field. Here he is, educating young Owen O'Donoghue, not himself the straightest of shooters, though entirely fictional. To my question about how he saw this playing out, McDermott replied, QAHN's trying to get O'Mahony to sink his cash into an old Confederate wreck, the E.H. Prey. Claims it will ship arms to Campobello and secure territory for the Irish Republic. Now the buts. But number one, the British fleet will be fully apprised. But number two, the Americans likewise. But number three, all arms will be seized. The result? Fenian treasure wasted, Fenian enthusiasm boiled into the air, a beautiful Fenian invasion ruckus all over New Brunswick newspapers, scaring everybody into the pro-Confederation ranks, all the aunties in the province discredited for good. Brilliant. Our hat is off to him. Bernard Doran Killian, not a lawyer for nothing. Owen, hats off to all those scheming Canadians, MacDonald and McGee included, though they see no evil and hear less. O'Mahony himself thought QAHN was secretly in league with Mr. D'Arcy McGee. And even the British consul in New York, Edward Archibald, felt it was difficult not to believe that QAHN deliberately played the part of a traitor in order to break up the organization. However, historian David A. Wilson is not convinced. While such suspicions among the anti-Confederates and the Fenians are understandable, they exist entirely in the realm of supposition. They cannot be supported by evidence and are too far-fetched to be taken seriously. Not, of course, that this would deter any good conspiracy theorist worth his or her salt, for whom the very lack of evidence only testifies to the success of the conspiracy. Nevertheless, circumstantial evidence does indeed exist. In the Roof Walkers to Owen O'Donoghue, Red McDermott expounds the following in one of his favorite lists. C. The Duncan, that's one of the largest warships of the British fleet. The Duncan sailed April 17th. That's when the godforsaken E.H. Pray to Lucifer arrives. Same day, Owen. Don't tell me that's a coincidence, because it isn't. The story is, there'll be bands playing and flags waving, and 700 regulars in full scarlet will troop aboard for the good people in Halifax Harbour to cheer and take note. That day, April 17th, not a coincidence, mind, the Premier of Nova Scotia will reintroduce a pro-Confederation bill in the legislature. Dead for a year and a half, Owen, that bill was. Dead as a doornail, now back to life. Lazarus it is. The Fenians can thank themselves to kingdom come. Without them, it would never have happened. Are you a happy man now? I say Killian deserves a knighthood. Greatest bastard father of confederation that ever breathed. I'll go further. Fenians, the whole kit and caboodle, all of them, greatest bastard fathers of confederation that ever waved an Irish flag. Are you a happy man, Owen? A chapter later, Charles Linehan, fictional journalist for the Irish Canadian, a real pro-Fenian publication, takes up the story of Killian's theatrics in language supported by local news reports of the day. Malloy and the boys are at the waterfront in Calais, and what do you think Killian's organized up there? I know he's got a big speech planned. The placards are already appearing. So my guess he wants to scare the living daylights out of the poor New Brunswickers across the St. Croix. Why, in God's name, I'll never know. So he has one of his men ride Paul Revere style up and down the St. Stephen's side of the river, hollering at the top of his lungs, "Arm yourselves, the Fenians are upon you." If he wanted to cry wolf, he couldn't have done a better job. The people on the other side, the New Brunswickers mind, get so much into a lather, they start packing their belongings in carts and streaming over the wooden bridge to Calais, thinking there's more safety there than in St. Stephen. The Fenians are upon you. There were no Fenians coming, not a one. Not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse, as they say. And that's not the end of his shenanigans. The next day, what do we see but bands of Killian's men drilling and marching and drilling in broad daylight, as close to the river as they can get, just so they don't go unnoticed, see? And to top it all off, there's a whole team of his people laying out firewood in piles up and down the waterfront road. I'm not making this up, God's truth. Up and down they go, setting out big piles of firewood all along the river. Then the nighttime comes and Killian gets the Calais fire bells ringing as if a plague of devils had descended. All the faggots are lit, and an unholy light graces our side of the river, an unholy lurid light gleaming for miles up and down the St. Croix. That's no lie, I'm telling you. 4 miles of bonfire light, and the fire bells tolling the Day of the Damned, and shots fired from old fowling pieces. You've never seen so many carts of tearful, panic-stricken women and children in all your life. You'd think the Lord's hosts were upon them. Well, that's exactly what they were made to believe. A hoax. Nothing but a hoax. Thomas D'Arcy McGee hated the Fenian movement, and it no doubt deeply satisfied him that they managed to engender the very thing they despised. The only reason Confederation passed, wrote historian P.B. Waite, was the Fenian invasions. Foiled and embittered, Fenians returned McGee's hatred with interest. Shortly after his narrow victory in the federal elections of September 1867, his murderer, Patrick James Whalen, is reputed to have said, "Although McGee is elected, the bloody old pig won't reign long, and I will blow his bloody old brains out before the session is over." On April 7, 1868, Whalen was as good as his word. Forgive a few personal reflections to conclude. 2 themes emerge from this martyrdom. The first is McGee's constant invocation of the primacy in any constitutional democracy of minority rights and the rule of law. How apposite, even heartbreaking, that McGee's sacrifice should have violated both principles. My affinity and affection for his spirit should come as no surprise. Like F.R. Scott, he was a lover of literature and of the Constitution. In a much smaller way, I have worked the same vein, shared many of the same passions and antipathies. David A. Wilson notes that McGee wanted to replace the names of the Conservative and the Reform parties with the more broad-based Constitutional Party. I like the term constitutional, McGee wrote, for its comprehensiveness. It includes the assertion as well as the conservation of great principles, as well as the jealous maintenance of all wholesome usages, established precedent, and lawful authority. Faced with our own Fenians here in Quebec, Wilson's colleagues from the history department at the University of Toronto, Michael Bliss, wrote the following to me as head of the Special Committee for Canadian Unity shortly after the second referendum in 1995. I am writing to endorse your committee's concern for the maintenance of the Canadian Constitution in Quebec. As I understood the Quebec government's proposed course of action, had there been a yes vote in the referendum, it would have led perhaps very quickly to illegal acts in the direction of a unilateral declaration of independence. Everyone who believes in democracy has to believe in the supremacy of the rule of law. If there is to be change, it has to be lawful change. When politicians or legislators or other groups of people begin taking the law into their own hands, they create something like a state of nature in which others have license to do the same and ultimately force rules. If the province of Quebec, for example, were to break the Canadian Constitution in an attempt to secede from Canada, it would in effect have suspended the rule of law. Nothing other than threats of force and violence would stand in the way of groups within Quebec, Aboriginals or others, from determining to maintain their loyalty to Canada. Indeed, the Loyalists would have a reasonable claim in both law and spirit to expect support from the rest of Canada. The other theme worthy of mention in conclusion is McGee's anxiety. He speaks of it on more than one occasion in his work, most notably at the beginning of a key paragraph from his Shield of Achilles speech previously quoted. I look to the future of my adopted country with hope, he wrote, though not without anxiety. One can only wonder how Thomas D'Arcy McGee would have reacted to two separate referenda on the breakup of Canada and on the abrogation of Quebecers' Canadian citizenship, both taking place within 15 years of each other, less than a generation apart, the second conducted outside the framework of any governing law whatsoever. What would this champion of minority rights have said when confronted with rendering the English language illegal in Quebec with regards to commercial expression, a fact which remains in effect in certain areas of provincial life, not to mention the pervasive notion, noxious in the extreme, that the use of English in the public sphere, even so much as to utter the word hello, has become somehow a threat to one's French-speaking neighbors. What would a former Canadian Minister of Immigration have said, faced with a law that deprived the English community's educational institutions of any influx of students from English-speaking countries? Faced, moreover, with a premier who declared at the time of the law's passage that should they wish to maintain their numbers, community members would henceforth have to rely on the power of their loins. No doubt McGee would have found his anxiety entirely justified. McGee's last words before his assassination bear repeating. Written on the 4th of April, 1868, my birthday as it happens, they come from a letter to the Irish Earl of Mayo, the subject, why Canadian Irish should feel loyal to the Crown. Quote, we are loyal because our equal, civil, social, and religious rights are respected by this government in theory and in practice. Were it otherwise, it would be otherwise. At the conclusion of the Roof Walkers, I have young Owen O'Donoghue write the following to his spymaster, the very real Gilbert McNicken. Exiled on the edges of my adopted city, vulnerable and disappointed in my country, I write this, my last letter to you, sir, as the only father of Confederation I'm ever likely to know. You can put me down in the column marked otherwise. I stand henceforth with the marginal, the unprotected, the few and far between. On all records and future documents, on the passport the American government now requires, you may call me otherwise Canadian. Thank you for listening, folks. Appreciate the attention.
Hello, Keith, and thank you very much. You and I have spoken about Fenians on a number of occasions in the past, and for my part, I grew up in the Niagara region, and as a young school child, I was taken on more than one occasion to the Battle of Ridgeway site, which at the time I thought was incredibly boring because it was just a field with a sign. But when I became an adult and moved into Missisquoi County, I was actually delighted to discover that Fenians came across not once, but twice into Missisquoi County in 1866 and 1870. And in this region, the Battle of Eccles Hill was defended by a border guard known as the Red Sashes. So the Red Sashes are a really big deal in this region. But for me, I've always had a bit of a soft spot for Fenians. Maybe it's my my grandmother whispering in my ear from County Monaghan, you know, where John O'Neill was from. But I wondered if you had, as people start to come on and onto the site to ask you questions, I wonder if you have an idea of how the Fenian legacy has changed from the 1870s up to the 21st century. If people are still quite negative about Fenians, or if there's a change in reaction to them, or if you have a sense about that.
Well, the big change from McGee's day is clearly the independence of Ireland and the Easter Uprising, etc., which kind of validated what the Fenians were trying to do. So I think clearly there has been a change in attitude. Though, let me put it this way. The issue of secession is fraught. It truly is. French Canadians are, generally speaking, quite nationalistic. It's understandable because they feel we understand. Defensive in their position in North America, that they're quite nationalistic. And I would argue they were among the first to try the democratic means towards secession. In that sense, they differ from Fenians, who were basically physical forcers. They wanted to do it by violent means, and they were not hesitant about that. These days, it's a question of democracy. So I think the whole question, referendums are at the forefront. It's become democratized, and with great difficulty too, I think, for many nations across the world, because there are many different groups inside countries. And if they were all given the democratic right to secede, we'd have a very fragmented world. So what am I saying? I'm saying the attitude towards Fenians has changed because of the independence of Ireland, but the new regime is very different from what happened in 1916 and up to 1922. It's now referendums, the supposedly democratic referendums, creating a lot of difficulty for central authorities, as you can see in Spain.
Very good. Thank you, Keith. I'd like to have everyone come on. If they'd like to ask Keith a question, you can reveal yourself, turn on your cameras, maybe keep yourself muted though. And if you have any questions, Glenn, I think we'll be able to spot you better than I can on my little screen. So
I see our loyal attendee, Vicky, has a question. Vicky,
Yeah.
turn on your mic. What's on your mind?
Okay. I think my mic's on, right? Okay, perfect. My question to you, Keith, is would you make a comparison between the 1837 Patriots and the Front de Libération du Québec and the Fenians? There's a link between them as for their patriotism and their nationalism, or in the
And their
way they
willingness to
fight.
rebel, because
Yes.
that's the point I was trying to make. That and you raise a good point about les patriotes. They weren't hesitant to use their rifles in to pursue their aims, and nor were the Americans back in 1775. These were violent revolutions with bloodshed, and the point I was trying to make is that we kind of evolved out of that to some degree, although goodness knows, you look at what's going on in Syria and you could change your mind in an instant. But in, shall we say, European countries in North America, because French Canadians are clearly part of North American society, here the issue has moved more towards referendums, votes instead of bullets, thank God. But as I was saying to Heather, I think it's created a huge problem for central authority. Spain. Spain, the Catalonians wanted to secede. They wanted a referendum, and the central government would not give it to them because they said under the Spanish Constitution, Spain is indivisible. So it's become a matter of international law. France is indivisible according to its constitution. Same thing in France. And there are certain separatist movements in, I don't know, Corsica and whatnot, who, don't necessarily want to be part of France, but they are illegal entities. So that's what I mean when I say there are profound difficulties for central governments faced with these democratic desires for secession. I don't have an easy answer, but generally speaking, international law at this point favors central governments. It does not give authority to secessionist movements. Unless, and there is this proviso, it's an important one, if a secessionist movement can prove that the people are oppressed and have no other means of, they have no government of their own, no independent institutions, then international law is in favor of armed rebellion. So point, it's a complicated matter.
I wonder if I might chime in with a question. I thought it struck something that sort of stuck with me was this comment you made about how refreshing this would be. I think you know what part I'm referring to. This idea of Canadian unity and having one identity. A few various thoughts on that. I feel like the idea of Canadian unity may have been slightly more obvious in McGee's day, just given the nature of immigration to Canada at the time, which was pretty, I don't know, two-dimensional, let's say, or three. But, compared to today, I feel like one of the things about unity and one of the struggles is how we remember as a society. And so I think this is very challenging in a place like Canada, where you have people coming from, these diasporas from all over the world. And really what you have to do, it seems to me, is you have to ask people to forget about where they came from to a certain extent and to accept a new set of symbols, a new set of traditions, a new set of cultural reference points. And I know, Keith, you've thought a lot about Canadian unity. How have you thought about this in terms of pluralism, multiculturalism, or various other aspects where there's a lot of people coming together from different backgrounds? I think it's problematic just because of the legacy of global colonialism. People are coming with a memory of crimes that were committed against their ancestors by the British, by the French, by whoever, European powers. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, D'Arcy McGee fits right into that because the Irish people suffered greatly under the famine. Half the population disappeared. So they understand oppression and they understand what it means to live under colonial oppression. That's what motivated them. That's why they became Fenians in many respects. Okay, so the second point I want to make is that McGee, having said what he said, was far more nuanced than people give credit for. He wanted a Canadian identity and a Canadian national sense. There's no doubt. But he didn't want and would never have wanted people to take their Irish cultural background. He never did himself. It was vital to him. So his position was nuanced. And what we're talking is a balance. And what he wanted was that not that people forget their Irishness, but they don't make their Irishness and their grievance Irishness the central focus of their lives, as the Fenians did, but recognize the wonderful opportunities that Canada gave them. That it was Canada that was the new experience, which enabled people to come from various backgrounds and live free lives. So I think he's not a multiculturalist. No, that doesn't mean he's some sort of, I don't know, call him what you will, like a racist and a bigot. No, not at all. He just felt that Canada did have a culture. It needed a culture. He was ready to participate in it. And he felt that other people's cultures could blend in the tapestry. The difference is that when you officially say Canada has no culture, which is what Pierre Trudeau said, that's not a balance. That's, I think, dangerous.
If anyone has any questions, just wave your hand. A few people have your video on. Fergus, come on the mic.
Am I on?
Can you hear me?
Can you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Fergus, you're on.
Yeah, okay. Hi, Keith. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Fergus. I missed your thing and I feel really bad about it.
Oh, too bad. Yeah, that's it. Talking about the Fenians, it's always been my impression that they were kind of their own worst enemy, in the sense that many times the Canadian authorities knew a great deal more about what they were going to do than they knew what they were going to do. There was a fair number of spies crossing back and forth, and that the Canadians could just send somebody into a bar in New York sitting with the Fenians and they'd hear the whole story of what was going on. Like, they weren't very good at keeping their plans to themselves. Do you have any comment on that? I mean, that's an impression I have.
Well, only this, that I think it's fair to say that the major Fenian incursion took the Canadian government by surprise. They thought that it would happen around St. Patrick's Day of that year. They were preparing for that. Obviously they knew about Eastport, Maine. That was major because it brought about as I said, the defeat of the New Brunswick anti-Confederation government. Major. Then along comes William R. Roberts. That took them by surprise. They weren't prepared for that. And you could argue, oh, well, they had spies. I'm not sure they did. I had a hard time with that because I made my fictional spy know what was happening and warn McMicken, and he didn't buy it. So that's the one area where they weren't very well attuned.
Thanks.
I think I believe someone had turned on their mic. It may have been Steven. I'm not sure if you had a question there.
Is that me?
Yeah, that's you. You're
Oh,
on.
that's it. I'm a bit of a fumbler. Keith, it's Steve. I've just read a biography, a very fine biography of Jefferson Davis. And of course, 1865 and 1866 was a very interesting period. Not only because, of course, the Americans, the Yankees won the Civil War, but there was a very large Confederate community in Quebec, in Toronto, and in Montreal. In fact, Jefferson Davis initially came to Montreal and then went down, as you know, to Lennoxville, which is close to where I live. Now, my question is this: did the Confederates, how did they deal with the Fenians, and were many of the Fenians Confederates? And if the Fenians were also Confederates as well as Yankees, how did the Confederate Fenians get along with the Yankee Fenians?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to it. All I can tell you is like refer back to attempts at unity. The attempts at unity meant, okay, let's put together a force of Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers that will attack Canada, and that will, because your point is well taken. There were a number of Fenians who fought for the Confederate side, and probably a larger number who fought for the Union side. So the American government itself was aware that they had a problem and thought that some kind of joint army exercise could make a statement of unity for the country. But as to how they actually got on with each other, I think that's a very hard thing to say. There are Fenian Confederates who never gave up their first allegiance to the South. And
yeah, the lost cause, yeah.
Yeah, and there were many Fenians who were clearly on the side of the American government, thinking this was the model that we want to emulate for Ireland itself.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
Thank you for that, Steve. Do we have any other questions? Wave your hand if you do. Heather has something.
I just wanted to know, what did the American government think of the Fenians? Were they, did they just sort of ignore them, or what was going on down there when the Fenians kept crossing the borders?
They were of two minds. They were really irritated with Great Britain because Britain had shown sympathy for the South. And there were naval incidents, etc., that the American central government was really angry about. In fact, Lincoln was lobbied to start a war with Great Britain, and his famous answer, I'm paraphrasing, is one war at a time. So and Seward was sympathetic to the Fenians. Andrew Johnson definitely was, but they had a problem. In fact, what they said, they're reputed to have said, because the Fenians lobbied them directly. If we go across the border, the American government knew about what was going on at Ridgeway. If we go across the border, how will you react? Because they had the ear of the authorities after Lincoln's death. And the answer was, we will recognize accomplished facts. Read that to mean, you go over and you accomplish what you wanted to, then we'll recognize it. If you manage to take over good portions of Ontario and whatnot, okay. They gave them 5 days to do what they could do. The American government gave them 5 days because from the get-go, this was illegal. This was a violation of the American Neutrality Act. You're not supposed to allow armed militias to go crossing the border and wreak havoc with a neighboring country. That was illegal, but they tolerated it for 5 days. And once they saw, oh, this isn't working out, they insisted that the Fenians come back. And there was a boat sent over and they were repatriated. And, you know, a little bit of a pro forma, okay, and bad, tut, shouldn't have done that. But most of them were just let go. So had they been successful, they didn't have the troops that they thought they would have had. But had they had the 20,000 troops that they expected to have, and they took over swatches of territory, that might have been a different thing. It might have been the Americans saying, okay, manifest destiny. We were thinking of doing it anyway. We don't like the British because they messed up with the Confederates, etc. It's going to happen. We're going to recognize accomplished facts.
Thanks, Keith. That's fascinating, isn't it? It's what a crazy time the 60s were, the 1860s. Yeah.
I have a related question, but I see Cindy with her hand up. Cindy, why don't you turn on your mic if you can? It's bottom left if you're looking for it. Or I'll send you a message. Just bottom left, Cindy, or that's where the mute button is, or a message will pop up. Huh. I'm going to ask a question. In the meantime, Cindy, see if you can figure that out. It's usually in the bottom left of the Zoom window, the microphone. In the meantime, I would like maybe to ask Keith and possibly Fergus or any representatives of the Montreal Irish community to talk about the memory of the Fenians in Quebec's Irish communities. I've done some work with Irish communities in the Gaspésie, north of Quebec City. You know, Republican songs are very popular. I always got the sense that there was sort of a soft spot for the Fenians, even if today people consider themselves proud Canadians. I wonder, Keith, maybe you could talk about that, and Fergus, if you want to chime in as well. I think that'd be interesting.
My sense is that the Irish community is split, as Ireland itself is. So it depends on which Irish person you speak to. Now I can understand there might be, oh my goodness, there's a certain romantic quality to this Irish rebellion, etc. But at the same time, the times of the troubles in Ireland are not that far removed from us. And it's what, a generation now going on since the Easter Peace Agreement. So I think, what am I trying to say? So there's a bit of a danger to romanticizing that sort of rebellion. And Ireland itself went through it. And I don't think they want to go back to that. I certainly hope not.
Fergus, would you talk about the Montreal angle there?
Yeah, I could add a little bit, not very much, because it's not ever been really a big issue within the community or big talking point. One thing interesting is that Thomas D'Arcy McGee was actually thrown out of the St. Patrick's Society of Montreal. Now, why was he thrown out? Well, there's all kinds of stories, but there seemed to be some kind of a Fenian undercurrent to the whole thing. When he started talking, and of course, a lot of people felt that he had betrayed the Fenian cause, D'Arcy McGee had. So there was probably enough Fenians within the St. Patrick's Society to somehow organize his quick removal from the place. Mm-hmm. There were other guys. I spoke in my talk about Bernard Devlin. He seems to have raised an entire group of soldiers to fight the Fenians. So he was obviously probably anti-Fenian. He was also much against McGee. The two of them always had this thing going. So I guess it's all mixed up, but it's not something that comes up too often in any conversations I have with Montreal Irish, members of Montreal Irish. I think it's kind of forgotten a little bit of history. It's probably really, as Keith knows, it's kind of important both to the democracy of our country, and in a lot of ways it was an important issue, but it's like so many other things, it kind of slides away and people forget about it, even though it was so big and such a humongous thing around the time of Confederation.
Glenn, let me add one point. May I do that?
Thank you, guys.
Please do.
Just a quick point. I'm not sure if my mic is working or somebody else.
It is. You're all good. Okay. Cindy got on another device, I think. But
the others with questions, and I don't want to intrude on their time. But one thing the Canadian government did was they hid all the information about the Irish Fenian invasions. They did not want this talked about. Canada is very good at sweeping under the rug. Excellent. We're very good at managing news and making sure that the stuff that's a little bit dicey, well, we're not going to talk about that. And they didn't. And I'll give you a modern example, which struck me, anyway. There was a convention about the Fenian raids, I think it was in 2016, 2017, organized by the people in Ridgeway. Of course they would organize it. It was very well done. They had representatives from Ireland, if not the Irish ambassador. It was very well done, and the Canada Council refused to support it. Just a little, it's why? I never got an answer. And this was a serious conference. I mean, David Wilson was there, etc. It was beautifully organized, and the Canada Council refused to support it. And it occurred to me as I was there, I said, this is what John A. Macdonald did back when this happened. He didn't want any of this news out there. So take it for what it's worth.
Right. I see Cindy. I think you managed to get on and turn on your mic. So what's on your mind, Cindy?
So I've read your book and I quite liked it. And I'm the one that got in contact with you about Francis Bernard McNamee. He was the one that brought the Fenian movement into Montreal. He's also my second great grandfather. His entire family were Fenians, and yes, they were all in St. Patrick's Society. Cousins, the Trahys, everyone you can think of. But as far as Fenians, I think, being wanting to separate, no. I think that during that time, it must have been extraordinarily hard seeing your people lying every which way, dying on the sides. He also did build the fever sheds in Montreal. He oversaw them. He also got typhus. He survived, obviously, or I wouldn't be here. But if you were to see what they saw, I think that also being forced out of their own country, that gives you a total different perspective. And I think their hearts were in the right place. I also don't think Whalen was the one that actually assassinated McGee. I think there's a little conspiracy there. I never did get to read the John A. Macdonald papers, but I understand that on his deathbed, McNamee left a judge a notice or a note or a letter with the name of the person who actually did. But that was it. Nothing ever came of it. And who knows? But I know that the family continued with the St. Patrick's Society right up until my grandfather during the war. But I live in the loyalist section. And the word Fenian is like Satan to Christians. I'm from Knowlton, so you know what that means. But I just think this whole group of Fenians were so overwhelmed with the amount of horrificness going on that they just wanted to do something about it. Not that they were against Canada, because I think they were actually proud Canadians. I think they were happy here. I think they just wanted to rid the British out of Ireland. That's my opinion.
Well, I read stuff that supports your opinion, that there are many Fenians during the day who articulated exactly what you just said, that they were proud Canadians and their Fenianism was against the British and what they did to Ireland. It was not against the Canadian government. So Fergus said it well. It's a complicated situation. There are various reactions, and but yours is it's not out of the mainstream for sure.
Anyway, I enjoyed your book.
Thank you.
Well, Glenn, are there any more questions that you can see?
I see Steve Luxton. I think he has one more. I'm going to ask you to unmute there, Steve. You'll see a message pop up in a second.
Okay, am I on?
You are.
Okay. This may or may not be a nuance. I don't know. I'm not very knowledgeable about the history of the Irish community in Canada. But it was once explained to me, and I don't know if this is true or not, and I'd like to know your feedback on this, because you people obviously know more about it than I do, that in fact there were two immigrations into Canada by the Irish. And I was told that the initial immigration into Canada by the Irish was in the 1780s and 70s and 90s, 1790s, and they established themselves by the 1840s and 1850s, and the cholera epidemic they had established themselves quite well. And in fact, when the cholera Irish, who are mostly very poor Irish, landed, packed into these ships in a hideous fashion, that the established Irish in Canada at that time, the ones that were established, actually did not go to their help. That it was the French Canadians that went to the help, essentially, and in fact, the established Irish, whatever their initial class origin when they left Ireland in the 1780s and 1790s, were definitely middle class and affluent at that time by the 1840s and 1850s. Now, I don't know if this is true or not, but this was explained to me. Now, in respect to the Fenians then, okay, if what I say is historically accurate, then you have sort of kind of a split Irish community facing, I suppose, the Fenian invasion. You would have, obviously in a very established Irish community, right, which was quite conservative. And you have obviously this new Irish community, which had been very kind of working class and had been sort of, extremely, had a very hard time. And I was wondering if that had anything to do either with McGee, right, and whom he felt he represented, and actually with the working out of the Canadian federal government in respect to the Fenian invasions. Or is that none of that true? I don't know. That's it. Keith.
That's a big question, Steve. It's a big one. I'll just add this, which doesn't answer your big question. I read about, and this fits into your argument, that there are a number of Irish people who came to Canada before the famine, which is undoubtedly true. And this story concerns a woman who told her family that she wanted to emigrate to Canada. And her husband told her she was crazy and he wasn't coming. And none of her sons were going to come. So she came alone because you got 100 acres or so. And she started to clear the 100 acres all by herself. And quite successfully too, because after a year or two, or I don't know how long, I'm guessing, she sort of kept up with her recalcitrant family and told them what she was doing. And I guess they all came over because they decided she was doing the right thing. You could get 100 acres of land in Canada. You absolutely could not get that in Ireland.
Fergus, you will have something to say about that. So come on the mic.
Okay, I'll turn on my mic. Yeah, just to answer a couple of the questions that were asked. First of all, yeah, there was some Irish around 1760 at the time, Plains of Abraham, because the Irish fought on both sides, the French and the English. And after that was over, a handful of them hung out and stayed in Quebec. The really first big immigration was probably in the 1820s, 1820 to late 1820s. They definitely were not super wealthy. Most of them having to do a lot with Napoleonic Wars and a lower price of food and a whole bunch of issues, but they left in the 1820s. They were considered pre-famine Irish, but no, they were certainly not all wealthy. Most of them ended up digging out the Lachine Canal, and that's how the neighborhood of Griffintown developed from that group. They were also mostly farmers, so many of them spread throughout other parts of Quebec. But some did, over the next 20-year period, actually get a few bucks and put something together, because in 1847, they built St. Patrick's Church. So obviously there were enough wealthy Irish doing stuff. How much they contributed to helping them in 1847, I don't know. but certainly the working class Irish who had come in 1820s and dug the Lachine Canal certainly did their share to help the Irish immigrants. So much so that they opened their door to these famine Irish, and whole families in Griffintown caught typhus from them and ended up giving up their lives, helping their fellow Irish, who often they didn't know. It was just like the Irish helping the Irish. So yeah, the two big waves were really the 1820s, not sick, but not rich. And then 1847, mainly carrying typhus and also not rich by any stretch. So anyway, I just wanted to clarify some of those points.
Fergus, I wonder if I could ask you about that, or anyone else who might know. I find that in the story of the Irish in Quebec, all we remember are the famine Irish, especially, obviously it's a very tragic narrative, but a lot of the established communities outside of Montreal, especially, it might be true in Montreal, but I'm more familiar with the Gaspé and Quebec City, north of Quebec City. Those are all pre-famine Irish communities. And I wonder about why we don't remember that aspect of our Irish history. And also, like, did the famine Irish, like, was it a massive wave that totally eclipsed these earlier Irish waves, or do you have a sense of that, the proportions?
No, not really. What ended up happening in the 1820s, of course, first of all, the majority of Irish in Quebec today, people who claim Irish heritage, regardless of their religion or whatever, or their language, and they claim Irish heritage, the greatest, largest majority are descendants of that first group from the 1820s, not from the famine Irish. The reason being that some of the famine Irish, a lot of the reason that they ended up coming through Gros Isle and Montreal was they were trying to get to the United States, and the states had closed off. In those days, the American immigration wasn't federal, it was actually state controlled. So New York, all the states along the border, kind of either put on a head tax that was so ridiculous, $5,000 equivalent a head, when these guys didn't have a buck, or they just closed the border completely. So the Irish coming in through Montreal, many of them from Quebec City, right from the Maritimes, as soon as if they were not sick, they just crossed the border and became Americans, Irish Americans. And then a lot of them after Montreal, the ones that survived the course, 13,000 died in Quebec between Gros Isle and Montreal. But the ones that survived Montreal, most of them went on westward to Ontario, to Cornwall, Kingston, Ottawa, Toronto, Hamilton, places like, and then some of them went back down into Detroit, Chicago, and areas like that. All to say that really the Irish that built Quebec, the people of Irish heritage that built Quebec, were almost entirely from that first group. Now, why people forget that, I don't know. People get mixed up, and I guess the 1847 was a much bigger event with a lot of deaths and stuff. And the 1820s was still a bunch of poor immigrants, but poor immigrants were everywhere, so who the hell cared? I mean, a few more or less didn't make much difference, but they did from 1820, about when they arrived, that second big group, up to 1847 from the second group. Don't forget that they had already organized enough to open the St. Patrick's Society, the St. Patrick's Church, St. Patrick's Parade. All of that was pre-famine. The starting of it was pre-famine. So they were a pretty active community prior to the arrival of the famine Irish. I don't know if that answered your question. I didn't want to go on.
Definitely did. Thank you, Fergus. I've always wondered about that dynamic, and that was my impression too. We can always think of these one-off anecdotes, and maybe they don't represent anything really, but Douglastown on the edge of the Gaspé Peninsula was a very Irish community until the 1980s, and it was founded by an Irish Catholic loyalist from upstate New York. As if there was such a thing, but he was chased out of New York State. He escaped death, and he was tarred and feathered, and he found his way to Gaspé. And I think there was often this ambivalence in people's identities between their religious identity, their ethnic identity, and then finding a new home in Canada. And his, other than the founder, the person that came right alongside him was also from Ireland, but was a sea captain in the British Navy. These stories don't fit neatly into our narratives, though, of, what constitutes these basic binary struggles in Canada.
That's the problem with history. Nothing ever fits into a nice little package, and people don't join that little package. There's always outliers somewhere that doesn't, You know, again, a lot of Irish went down into the States at 1847. A lot of them came back up to Canada after they took one look and said, nah, it's not for me. Almost like McGee, of course, who went to New York and then said, nah, I don't like being in America. I'm coming to Canada. Oh, I like this much better. So it's really, yeah, unfortunately, people just, it's just not, history just doesn't allow people to be all put into that same little box just because they were Irish or because they were Catholic or because they were French or because they were English or anything. You know, they always a few messing around on the outskirts.
Thank you, Fergus. Keith, do you have any thoughts there? I think we should maybe start wrapping up soon.
No, I've given all my thoughts. Follow them, Glenn. Yes, shared them all.
All right, it was great. Anyone wave your hand, it's last chance. All right. Heather, why don't you wrap up for us?
All right, sounds good. I have a feeling we could do a whole conference on Irish history. This has been wonderful. Thank you, Fergus, for tag teaming with Keith too. That was great. And Keith, thank you so much. I mean, the Fenians are such a rich history behind them. So I really appreciate what you've unfolded for us tonight, and more about Thomas D'Arcy McGee as well. And obviously, you've created such a community of conversation here. We could keep going, but Glenn's right. We should probably wrap it up. But I want to thank everybody who's joined us this evening and who's come on board on Facebook Live and on Zoom. Our next presentation, we're going to be having a bit of a break because of Passover and Easter. So our next presentation will be Thursday, April 8th at 7 o'clock right here on Heritage Talk Facebook Live. We're going to be listening to Caitlin Bailey, who's the director for the Canadian Centre for the Great War. And she's going to be talking about the man behind the curtain, Andrew McNaughton and the First World War. So that's going to be quite something, quite interesting. So mark your calendars for April 8th, Thursday. So enjoy the evening, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. See you in a couple of weeks and enjoy the spring weather. Take care and good night.